Hello and welcome to another 100% human video, my friends. Today we're gonna do a little bit of a YouTube exclusive again. It's gonna be ranking time, I would say. I'm not quite sure if this is a ranking. It's, I believe, more so what bosses I felt were the hardest bosses. That said, this is going to be a first playthrough perspective. Some of these first playthroughs are obviously from quite a long ago, but I will try to go back and think about how I felt playing through it, what were the hardest bosses. I will not talk too much about the bosses in particular, because otherwise this video would be way too long. I want this to be like around 10 to 15 minutes maybe. If it's a little longer, it's a little longer. Tom is obviously gonna cut it, and he can put me like somewhere into the gameplay or something, whatever you want to do, Tom. I will not talk about Demon Souls, because Demon Souls, in my opinion, has no really hard boss fights. We're going to start with Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 1, personally, in the base game, I felt like were not a lot of hard boss fights overall. The hardest boss fights on Dark Souls 1, without a doubt, were the DLC boss fights. That's like it is in most of the Fromsoft games. And for Dark Souls 1, it's certainly number 1, Calamite. Calamite is the dragon boss fight you get in the DLC when you go through the cutscene with Goth, and Goth shoots down like Calamite, and then you go back to the arena and you start fighting Calamite, and it is a very difficult dragon boss fight. Lots of damage, fire breath attacks everywhere, and it is not easy. It took me quite some attempts to beat Calamite, and I would say definitely one of the hardest DS1 boss fights. Number 2 in Dark Souls 1, most of you guessed it, is Manos. You know, it's the last boss of the DLC. It's the hand guy. The arena is one part why I think Manos is pretty hard. And attack variety, especially on phase 2, including the magic attacks, where he has, I believe, 3 different magic attacks. The rain, when the magic comes from the outside, and when he shoots at you with the staff. That's when it becomes really, really difficult. It's a lot of damage, and he can follow up really quickly. That's why I think Manos is definitely number 2. On the Dark Souls 1 list. The rest is also, some are hard, like O and S, but I wouldn't say it's like nearly as hard as those two. Now we're gonna jump to Dark Souls 2, guys. Dark Souls 2 has a lot of bosses, that's for sure, but most of them are actually not very hard. Again, we gotta jump into the DLCs, because that's, as I mentioned earlier, is where the hardest bosses are. For Dark Souls 2, I would say in the Ice DLC, Elium Lois, right, it's called? The Ivory King is very, very, very tough. Like, the Ivory King is a situation where you drop down and then you have like these, I don't know, portals. And there are like enemies coming out of the portals, and depending on how many knights, like these knights you save throughout the DLC, they will help you fight these enemies, and then after this sequence is over, it like goes into the boss fight itself. It's quite a long sequence. The boss fight itself, the Ivory King, is also hard. Yeah, he's quick, and obviously you have to survive the gank fight first, and then you go into the boss fight, which makes it a really hard fight. Sur Alone is a very, very tough fight in my opinion. Also very tough to get there, because you have to like run through a certain like amount of enemies to get into the fight. And that alone makes it tough. Sur Alone is really quick. It has a really cool sequence, if you didn't know about this. When you beat Sur Alone without taking a single hit, then you'll get a different ending to the fight. He will seppuku himself, where he kills himself because you beat him honorably without taking a single hit, basically, which is really dope. Number 3 would be Blue Smelter Demon. Some of you might say, oh, Blue Smelter Demon is the same Smelter Demon than in the other Smelter Demon. There are so many Smelter Demons. That's true, but I think the Blue Smelter Demon, or what is hard about the Blue Smelter Demon, is getting there. Like, the running section to the Blue Smelter Demon is such a tough thing to do, with these magicians that slow you down, and then there are these like golems, and as you know, you can't go through fog walls without getting tagged by anything there. There are archers, there are these like knights attacking you. It's so tough to get there, and that alone makes Blue Smelter Demon like such a hard task to get past, because you have to go there, and you have to run this section over and over again. It's very annoying. And the last one for Dark Souls 2, I would say, is Lut and Zalon. Lut and Zalon is the tiger duo after the Horse Beep Valley. I don't know, you guys know it, right? Where you run through and there are these snowstorms and the horses come and the horses attack you. It is absolutely terrible, and at the end of this, there's also a really hard boss fight. It's the king's pets. It's 2 of those cats. First you fight one, and then the second one joins the fight. And if you don't have the damage to finish one off, then you have to fight 2 cats at once, and it's absolutely terrible. And it's really, really hard. And on my level 1 run on Dark Souls 2, these almost broke me. Not gonna lie. Now we're gonna jump to my personal favorite, Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 has a lot of hard bosses. On my first playthrough, I struggled with quite some. I have to add and say that on my first playthrough in Dark Souls, I played through the game with limited vigor. I had basically a challenge run on my first playthrough, you could say. I picked a class and I did not level up my HP bar at all. And then I entered the dancer fight for the first time, and the dancer slapped my cheeks. For, I believe, 60 plus attempts, I couldn't beat the dancer. Funnily enough, the first attempt I almost killed it. I mean, we all had that already, right? When you almost kill a boss and then you get like slapped for another 50 attempts. That was for me the dancer. That's why it's on this list. For me, a beautiful boss fight, but it's also a very, very hard one as well. Number 2 would be Pontiff, because I did not know that you can parry Pontiff. And when you do not know that, then Pontiff becomes like a really tough boss fight, because he's quick and he has these like very long combos and you don't know where to go, and standing in front of him is not good, standing behind him is not good, nothing's good, and he's gonna clap you multiple times. And the moment you realize you can parry Pontiff, it gets much easier. For the time you don't know that, it's, in my opinion, one of the hardest boss fights on Dark Souls 3, at least in the base game. So now we're gonna jump into the DLC for Dark Souls 3. Number 1 would be Sister Frida. Sister Frida is just too long. 3 phases. When you go there the first time and you experience this, and then you beat the first phase and you are so happy to make it, and then you're in the second phase and you despair and despair, and then you beat second phase and you feel like, oh my god, I finally did it, and then she is like standing back up again and you're like, oh my god, what is going on? Why am I doing this? A lot of people probably had a long time grinding Frida. She's one of the hardest. Also a very cool boss fight on the other hand. I really like Frida, but she's tough, so definitely part of this list. And now we're gonna jump into the second DLC. The Ringed City has some really, really hard boss fights, starting with the demon twins, of course. Depending on what demon you kill first, you get a different second phase. But regardless of what you kill first, both is hard. First you have to deal with the double boss, and then you get like a tough single boss right after. So the demon twins, I would say, definitely one of the hardest Dark Souls 3 boss fight, and has to be part of this first playthrough list. Number 5 on Dark Souls 3 would be Midir. To be honest, like, the moment you figure out how to do it, that you stand in front of Midir and that you punish his head, it becomes like much easier. But you don't know it on a first playthrough, right? And most of us, at least I did that. You run down below the dragon and you try to hit the leg and you try to hit like the tail or whatever, and nothing works really. You don't do any damage, and Midir becomes a almost impossible task, because he will get you like with the fire attacks or the laser attacks, or he just jumps away and charges at you, whatever it may be. Midir is a super hard boss fight when you fight him like this, and when you do not know to, punish his head and stand in front of him. And last but not least, I would say the Red Cape, Gale. Various phases, I believe 3 different phases, right? The crossbow, the amount of HP as well. You have to learn a lot of attacks. It all changes with every phase. The lightning coming from down below when he like spreads this like bubble stuff everywhere. In my opinion, one of the hardest Dark Souls 3 bosses. The next game is going to be Sekiro. Also a ton of hard boss fights. I gotta preface by saying that I will not include the Mortal Journey, like the gauntlet, into this. I will just go off what I experienced in my playthrough, My first playthrough was Immortal Severances. For me personally, the Twin Ape boss fight was really, really hard. It took me quite some time to figure out how to separate both. that I don't get like, you know, fucked over by one when I like fight the other. It is a very, very tough fight in my opinion, and for me personally, one of the hardest on my first playthrough. Number 2 is the Owl Father. The Owl Father is one of the difficulty spikes in Sekiro, I would say. The moment I arrived there and I picked like the option to fight Owl Father is when I started struggling a little bit. That was probably one of the harder boss fights I had to take on. He's quick and with these smoke bombs and jumps around and attacks furiously, and he does a lot of damage as well. I would say one of the hardest bosses on Sekiro. Definitely, at least for me. The next two, most of you guys won't be surprised by, are the last 2 boss fights of Immortal Souls. Number 1 is the Demon of Hatred. The Demon of Hatred, like 3 phases, right? And it's completely different. Like, there's no sword-to-sword combat. You have to chase after him all the time. It's like jumping away with these, like, when he starts whipping with his arm. And it was such a terrible thing to learn. I really do not like the Demon of Hatred as well. I think it's not an enjoyable boss fight at all. And the last one, of course, as you guessed, Sword Saint Ishin, Glock Saint Ishin, shooting into your face. A million faces, a million red dots on the left upper, like, health bar. You have to go past Genichiro first, basically, and then he crawls out of Genichiro, and he's starting to clap your cheeks, because that's what he does, for hours. It took me hours to beat him. I can only recommend, if you didn't play Immortal Souls, go and play it. On a first playthrough, it's probably, like, one of the most fun I had with a Fromsoft game in a while. Next one is going to be Bloodborne, ladies and gentlemen. Bloodborne has not a lot of hard boss fights on base game. Write it down in the comments if you think there's something different or I forgot about something. But in my opinion, Bloodborne base game, the only boss I struggled with, Logarius. I can't think of another boss that was like, oh my god, I did like really struggle with it. I don't know, actually, but Logarius was definitely one of the harder ones. I remember my BL4 playthrough as well. It took me like hours, like 6, 12, I don't know how many hours to beat Logarius. When he sticks his sword down into the ground and then they come flying out, like the other swords come flying out and the skulls fly at you and he flies up in the air and twists down on you and everything happens at once and explosion and everything, then I don't know, like it was just too much for me. I know you can parry him with the gun and it's quite nice, but it took me quite some time to figure all of that out and to get like you know, flow of combat going. Next one would be German. For some reason, I had less attempts on German than I had on Logarius, but also a very hard boss fight for sure. And depending on how you like go through the game, you have like the Moonlight Presence afterwards. Moonlight Presence. Which is also not an easy boss, but I would say Gerben is harder than the Moonlight Presence. At least I had like not as much struggles with the Moonlight Presence. Then we jump into the DLC, and the hardest 2 bosses for me personally in the Bloodborne DLC was 1, Orphan of Kos, of course. Especially phase 2 when he starts like slamming his weapon down and he goes all enraged mode and everything happens so fast. I think Orphan was an absolute like hard thing to learn, especially in phase 2. Like it took me so long to understand all of this and what's going down, and like when he jumps up and then you lose like sight of him and he throws these like balls onto the ground and then he's behind you and then he's in front of you and then he's besides you and then he throws another one. It's just so, there's so much going on and it took me quite a while to understand it. And the last one for Bloodborne, but also the most beautiful boss fight on Bloodborne in my opinion, Ludwig. Ludwig is a very hard fight, but also, especially phase 2 in my opinion as well, a very hard fight, but also one of the best boss fights I think on Bloodborne and in general Fromsoft. Ludwig is just so cool. The moment like he stands up and looks at his sword and realizes he's like still part human and then he starts slashing your ass. It's super dope. I really like Ludwig a lot from like a fight perspective and also lore perspective and a horse perspective, all perspectives, you know, like Ludwig is a beautiful horse. Elden Ring, I gotta say, there's no doubt on the base game, we all agree that Malenia is the hardest boss fight, right? We all had to suffer through with the waterfall, we had to learn it, we had to die to it. Even when you summon on Malenia, it oftentimes doesn't make it much easier because she waterfowls and she heals a lot. with the summons as well. Has to be on that list, you know, without a doubt. As a replacement for most DLC bosses, because the DLC bosses on Shadows of the Erdtree, they're all hard. I mean, depending on how you fight Mesmer or Midra, you can like poise break them easily, and you know, you can bleed them, and then it becomes a little bit easier. But every DLC boss is a very hard boss. In my opinion, I struggled with all of them on my first playthrough. Instead of naming every DLC boss, I'm gonna just say Concert Radahn. It's also, to round up the video a little bit, Concert Radahn is the hardest boss fight I've ever fought, I believe. I remember still after the DLC released and we played through it, and I, you know, had experienced all the bosses. We tried to no-hit Concert Radahn on level 1, and it took me, I don't know, 15 hours to get him hitless once. Especially in second phase, when he starts raining down on you and there's lightning everywhere. Like, getting through this fight without taking a hit is very hard. Like, very, very hard. I hope you enjoyed this type of videos, guys, because it's a lot of fun for me to just, you know, ramble on a little bit every once in a while. If you have ideas about future videos like this one, write it down below in the comments. As you know, it also helps with the algorithm. If you enjoyed this one, give it a like or maybe subscribe to the channel. You can also check out my challenge running streams here on YouTube or maybe on Twitch, because I'm live there every day, basically. Please write your experiences of your first playthrough down below. Love you. Say it back. Cheers. Let's go! 15 hours! You
dinossindgeil, unkindled slayer of lords, thine destiny awaits. May the flames guide thee.